In the aftermath of the First Indochina War, the United States viewed Vietnam not simply as a distant landlocked conflict, but as a strategic chess piece in the larger Cold War board. In Washington's eyes, the fall of South Vietnam to communism could trigger the domino effect, toppling neighboring nations across Southeast Asia into the Soviet and Chinese orbit. In 1954, following the Geneva Accords, the US shifted from indirectly supporting France to directly intervening in Vietnam's future. The plan was clear: turn the southern half of the country into a bulwark against communist expansion. To achieve this, America poured vast resources into creating and sustaining the Republic of Vietnam. South Vietnam under President Ngo Dinh Diem, a man Washington believed could stand firm against the North. Billions of dollars in military and economic aid flowed in. American advisors trained and armed the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, with modern weapons. Infrastructure projects promised to modernize the country and strengthen its economy. On paper, it seemed like the perfect formula for building a loyal, anti-communist ally. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. The US had placed its bet not on the will of the Vietnamese people, but on the survival of a political regime that was deeply dependent on foreign backing. This was not a foundation built on trust, shared vision, or national unity. It was built on fear of communism and the illusion that money and weapons alone could secure victory. What America didn't yet realize was that in Vietnam, military hardware and economic aid could never replace the one thing essential for enduring power: legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And without it, the first steps the US took into Vietnam were not steps toward victory, but the beginning of a slow, irreversible descent into a quagmire. From the very beginning, the Republic of Vietnam, Washington's hand-picked partner, carried within it the seeds of collapse. President Ngo Dinh Diem, hailed by US officials as a staunch anti-communist leader, was in reality the head of a regime deeply out of touch with its own people. Power in Saigon was concentrated within the Diem family. Ngo Dinh Nhu served as his chief advisor, and political strategist Ngo Dinh Thuc held sway as Archbishop of Huc. Ngo Dinh Can controlled political organizations in the central provinces. This family dynasty ran South Vietnam like a private fiefdom, blending politics, religion, and personal loyalty into an authoritarian system that tolerated no dissent. The regime's policies alienated broad segments of the population. Peaceful opposition movements were suppressed. Suspected communists, and often simply those who disagreed, faced the brutal anti-communist denunciation campaigns, complete with arrests, torture, and public executions. In rural areas, the government's inability to improve living conditions fostered resentment, while corruption siphoned off much of the US aid intended for development. The most explosive flashpoint came in 1963, when the Diem government's repression of the Buddhist majority sparked massive protests. Images of monks setting themselves ablaze on the streets of Saigon shocked the world. Instead of addressing grievances, the regime cracked down even harder, deepening political instability. By late 1963, Washington's faith in DMI had eroded. In November, with tacit US approval, a group of South Vietnamese generals staged a coup, assassinating Diem and Nhu. Yet removing the head of the regime did not cure its underlying sickness. In the years that followed, South Vietnam lurched from one unstable government to another. Corruption persisted, morale in the army plummeted, and political leadership proved incapable of uniting the country. America had built its war effort on an ally that could not stand on its own. And soon, this weakness would force the US to sink even deeper into the conflict, committing not just its money and weapons, but its own soldiers and blood. By the mid-1960s, Washington had made a fateful decision. If South Vietnam couldn't win on its own, America would fight the war for them. The strategy was rooted in a simple and dangerously flawed belief: overwhelming firepower could break the enemy's will to fight. The US unleashed the full weight of its military machine. Waves of B-52 bombers carpet-bombed suspected communist strongholds. Napalm and Agent Orange scorched forests and poisoned farmland. Massive search and destroy operations swept across the countryside, intended to root out the Viet Cong and cripple North Vietnamese supply lines. Yet the enemy did not fight on America's terms. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sprawling network of jungle paths and hidden supply routes stretching from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, proved nearly impossible to shut down. Despite relentless bombing campaigns, the flow of weapons, food, and troops into the South continued. Even the infamous Steel Tiger and Commando Hunt air operations failed to choke the lifeline. Worse, the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics neutralized much of America's technological advantage. They fought close to U.S. forces, rendering air support risky. They struck swiftly from hidden tunnels, then vanished into the dense jungle. Every village, every rice paddy, could conceal a fighter or a trap. In this environment, America's doctrine of body counts and attrition warfare became meaningless. Success was measured in numbers killed, but territory remained contested, and enemy morale unbroken. The more the US escalated, the deeper it became trapped in a war of endurance, a war in which time, not technology, would decide the victor. And time was something the Vietnamese had in abundance. For them, this was not a distant conflict. It was a fight for their homeland, their families, and their independence. America had the bombs, but Vietnam had the patience, and that would prove far deadlier. To American generals, the Vietnam battlefield was a nightmare they could never fully understand. The US military was built for large-scale, conventional wars, massive tank battles, sweeping offensives, and clear front lines. Vietnam offered none of that. The People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, and the Viet Cong fought with a mastery of guerrilla warfare refined over centuries of resisting foreign invasions. Their hallmark tactic was summed up in a single chilling phrase: grab the enemy by the belt. It meant staying so close to US forces that airstrikes and heavy artillery became too dangerous to use. In these close-quarters battles, America's technological edge all but vanished. Jungle terrain became the Vietnamese fighters' greatest ally. Dense canopies hid movement from aerial surveillance. Tunnels snaked for miles beneath villages, allowing entire units to appear, attack, and disappear as if swallowed by the earth. Bamboo traps, concealed mines, and sudden ambushes turned every footstep into a gamble. To us soldiers, it was like fighting ghosts. One moment, the jungle was still. The next, gunfire erupted from nowhere. An enemy squad could melt into the undergrowth before reinforcements arrived. Night patrols were haunted by whispers, distant footsteps, and the constant fear of unseen eyes. This psychological pressure eroded American morale. Soldiers began to distrust the very civilians they were sent to protect, unsure if the farmer in the rice paddy was an ally or a lookout for the Viet Cong. The war was no longer a matter of seizing territory. It was a test of endurance and mental resilience. For the Vietnamese fighters, every skirmish was a small part of a much larger picture, a war of attrition, not in body counts, but in willpower. And in that contest, they had a decisive advantage. They were fighting for their land, their people, and a cause they believed in. America's soldiers were fighting for a political objective, half a world away. By the late 1960s, the battle for Vietnam was no longer confined to jungles and rice paddies. It had spilled into the living rooms of millions of Americans. For the first time in history, a war was being broadcast almost in real time, its brutal images flickering on television screens across the United States. The American public saw burning villages, wounded civilians, and exhausted US soldiers trudging through the mud. They saw the horror of napalm strikes and the chaos of urban firefights. It was a stark contrast to the optimistic speeches coming from the White House, which insisted that victory was just around the corner. Journalists like Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, broke ranks with official narratives. After visiting Vietnam, Cronkite famously concluded on national television that the war was unwinnable. His words resonated with millions and marked a turning point in public opinion. Universities became centers of resistance. Students organized mass protests, burned draft cards, and clashed with police. Draft dodgers fled to Canada rather than risk being sent into what they saw as a pointless, immoral conflict. Even returning veterans joined the anti-war movement, testifying about atrocities and the futility of the mission. The government's credibility crumbled under the weight of what came to be known as the credibility gap, the yawning divide between official statements and the reality on the ground. The more Washington insisted that progress was being made, the more the American people doubted it. By 1969, the anti-war movement had swelled into a political force that could not be ignored. 500,000 protesters marched on Washington in one of the largest demonstrations in U.S. history. The message was clear. America's war in Vietnam was losing not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of its own citizens. In the early hours of January 31st, 1968, during Tit, a Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the war exploded into a scale of violence America had not imagined. For months, US and South Vietnamese commanders had assured the public that the enemy was on the brink of collapse. The Tet holiday was expected to bring a temporary lull in fighting. Instead, the Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam launched a massive, coordinated offensive across more than 100 towns and cities. They struck at provincial capitals, military bases, and even the heart of Saigon itself. The most shocking blow came when a small Viet Cong unit penetrated the heavily guarded US Embassy compound. For hours, American military police fought to drive them out, while the world watched in disbelief. Militarily, the Tet offensive was costly for the attackers. They suffered heavy casualties, but strategically, it was a masterstroke. It shattered the illusion that the US and South Vietnam were in control. It proved that the enemy could strike anywhere, at any time, even in places considered secure. For the American public, Tet was a psychological earthquake. If 500,000 US troops, supported by the most advanced technology and firepower on Earth, could not prevent such a widespread assault, then victory seemed like a distant fantasy. Journalists, who had once echoed official optimism, now spoke with grim realism. Walter Cronkite, after visiting Vietnam in the wake of Tet, told Americans on national television that the war was a stalemate and that negotiations, not victory, were the only way forward. President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly remarked, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." From that moment, the war's momentum began to shift, not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who had to sustain it. The Tet offensive had not just bloodied America's forces, it had wounded its confidence, perhaps fatally. In 1971, a bombshell dropped on the American public, not from the skies over Vietnam, but from the front page of the New York Times. A classified study known as the Pentagon Papers revealed what many had begun to suspect. The US government had been lying for years, not just about the war's progress, but about its very purpose. Leaked by former Defense Department analyst Daniel Ellsberg, the documents detailed decades of secret decisions and covert actions in Vietnam, dating back to World War II. They showed how for successive presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had steadily escalated US involvement, while publicly assuring the nation that America sought no wider war. Perhaps most damaging was the revelation that key officials knew early on that victory might be impossible, yet continued to send troops into harm's way. Behind closed doors, the war was described as unwinnable. In public, it was sold as essential to stopping communism. The American people learned that US forces had secretly bombed Laos and Cambodia, launched covert raids on North Vietnam, and manipulated events to justify escalation, all without the knowledge or consent of Congress or the public. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Trust in the government, already eroded by years of casualty reports and broken promises, collapsed entirely. The credibility gap became a canyon. For many Americans, the Pentagon Papers confirmed the darkest fear. Their sons and daughters were dying in a war built on deception. The revelations didn't just inflame the anti-war movement. They fundamentally altered the relationship between the US public and its leaders. From that point on, every promise about the war was met with skepticism, every official statement questioned, and in a conflict where public support was as vital as battlefield success, this loss of faith was another step toward inevitable defeat. By late 1972, the United States was desperate to end the war on terms it could present as honorable. President Richard Nixon had pledged to achieve peace with honor, but negotiations in Paris had stalled. When North Vietnam refused to yield to last-minute US demands, Nixon resorted to what he believed would be a decisive show of force. On December 18, 1972, Operation Linebacker II began, a massive aerial assault later known as the Christmas bombing. For 11 relentless days, waves of B-52 flying fortresses and fighter bombers pounded Hanoi, Haiphong, and other key targets in North Vietnam. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The strikes were designed to break Hanoi's will and force them back to the negotiating table. But the campaign produced a result Nixon had not anticipated. North Vietnam's air defenses fought back with ferocity, downing more than a dozen B-52s, aircraft long touted as virtually invulnerable. In the streets of Hanoi, anti-aircraft fire lit up the night sky. and the invincible U.S. war machine suffered some of its most visible and humiliating losses. Internationally, the bombings drew widespread condemnation. Images of civilian devastation made headlines around the world, reinforcing the perception of America as a superpower willing to unleash overwhelming destruction against a small, determined nation militarily. The operation achieved little beyond accelerating what was already inevitable: a U.S. withdrawal. On December 30th, Nixon abruptly halted the bombing. Less than a month later, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The Christmas bombing had been intended to demonstrate America's strength, but it instead revealed the limits of its power. After years of war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and billions spent, the United States was preparing to walk away, leaving behind a South Vietnamese government that could not survive without it. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, marking what was officially presented as the end of America's direct involvement in Vietnam. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of all U.S. combat troops, the return of prisoners of war, and a commitment from both North and South Vietnam to respect each other's territories. In Washington, the deal was hailed as peace with honor. In reality, it was little more than a diplomatic fig leaf. North Vietnamese forces remained in the south. The Viet Cong still controlled large swaths of territory, and the South Vietnamese government, stripped of its American lifeline, faced a battle it was ill-prepared to fight alone. By March 29, 1973, the last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam. The departure was quiet, almost unceremonious, a stark contrast to the triumphant rhetoric that had once promised victory. What remained behind was a fragile ally in Saigon, dependent on dwindling American aid and plagued by corruption, political infighting, and low morale. For the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, the absence of American firepower was a crushing blow. Training and equipment could not replace the vast network of air support, logistics, and intelligence that had propped them up for years. Meanwhile, the North was regrouping, resupplying, and preparing for the final push. Back in the United States, the public, weary from years of war and scandal, had little appetite for renewed intervention. The anti-war movement had achieved its goal. America was out. But for the people of South Vietnam, the fight was far from over. In truth, the Paris Peace Accords had not brought peace. They had merely set the stage for the final act, one in which the United States would watch from afar as its ally faced a relentless and unstoppable advance. And in just 2 years, the war's last chapter would close in a way that would sear itself into history. In early 1975, the end came with stunning speed. The North Vietnamese launched a series of lightning offensives across the Central Highlands, shattering ARVN defenses. Cities fell in rapid succession. Ban My Thuot, Hue Da Nang, as panic swept through the South Vietnamese ranks. Entire units disintegrated, abandoning weapons, vehicles, and even civilians in chaotic retreats. By April, the North Vietnamese army was closing in on Saigon. President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned and fled the country, denouncing the United States for abandoning its ally. His departure only deepened the sense of collapse. Roads leading out of the capital were clogged with desperate refugees, while the sound of artillery fire drew closer each day. On April 29th, the final phase of Operation Frequent Wind began. U.S. helicopters swarmed over Saigon, ferrying thousands of American personnel and select South Vietnamese evacuees, 2 ships waiting offshore. The scenes were seared into the world's memory. Frantic crowds at the U.S. Embassy gates, Marines pushing people back as helicopters lifted off from the rooftop into the smoky night. The next morning, April 30, 1975, a North Vietnamese tank smashed through the gates of the presidential palace. The war was over. The Republic of Vietnam ceased to exist. The world's most powerful military had failed to secure victory, despite spending nearly 2 decades, sacrificing over 58,000 American lives, and pouring billions of dollars into the conflict. For the United States, Vietnam was more than just a lost war. It was a wound to its national pride, a question mark over the limits of American power, and a permanent scar in its political and cultural memory. It reshaped U.S. foreign policy, breeding caution in future interventions and sparking a long, uneasy debate over the meaning of victory. For Vietnam, the victory came at an enormous cost. Millions dead or wounded, cities destroyed, and a land scarred by decades of fighting. Yet, for its people, April 30th marked the fulfillment of a long, bloody struggle for national reunification, a testament to the enduring power of determination over might. The fall of Saigon was not just the end of a war, it was the closing act of a story in which technology, wealth, and firepower were humbled by resilience, unity, and the will to endure, and its echoes still shape the world today.